Dear friends, next year, 2017, February 24th, I will be completing 30 years of my priesthood. And in all these 30 years, I had wonderful, great experiences. When I baptized the people, when I gave them first Holy Communion, confirming them, and attending wedding celebrations, blessing the weddings, and sometimes enriching also, going to the homes of the homebound, where they would call me to give Holy Communion, confess them, and anoint the sickly. It's all enriching in one way or the other. And what I do always I try to transmit the presence of Christ risen. Now in all these experiences, the most difficult moments in my priesthood were celebrating a funeral, right, of a young man or woman or a young child. That is the most devastating and difficult moment for us priests as well as for the family. Now you try to find words to console the family members, especially the parents. Now in my previous parish, it was a huge parish, I had many occasions where I had to preside over these funeral ceremonies of young children and young men and women who met with accident, who died due to drowning, who died due to overdose of drugs, or who died also due to some illnesses that were incurable. So these are the tough moments where you will really run short of words to console people. Now that was the situation Jesus was in. And Jesus could say only one word to that woman who was a widow. As there was a huge procession on the part of Jesus because Jesus was a preacher, teacher, miracle worker. People surrounded him. There were all disciples. There was a huge crowd going towards that village of Nain. And now there was another sad procession coming out of that village, carrying this young man who died. And Jesus could say only these words, "Woman, do not weep." We always tell that. Whenever a person weeps, we always say, "Do not weep." Now what can we do? Do not weep, do not continue to weep. We need to find a solution for your problem. Now Jesus says, "Do not weep." And then he touches the pallet or the pyre, because in that time they did not have these caskets as we have today, the modern caskets. Those days they were wrapping up the body in a kind of mattress or whatever. They were carrying the body for burial. And Jesus, going beyond all kinds of traditions, now he breaks a kind of tradition here, touching the pyre. No one was allowed to touch the pyre. Even a Pharisee who was supposed to be with the people, who had to touch people, he was not supposed to touch a pyre or a corpse. There were many other reasons why it happened. There was a kind of restriction. People believed in one way or the other because of the tradition that if they had touched a corpse or a pyre, they would be unclean and they had to go to the temple, offer some sacrifices, they had to cleanse themselves of their with a bath, ritual cleansing. But Jesus touches it and they stop. And what does he do? He says, "Young man, rise." And he gets up and he entrusts him to his mother. Therefore, first reading taken from 1 Kings chapter 17, we have a similar situation. Prophet Elijah was residing in the house of the widow of Zarephath on the upper room. And the widow's son died. And she cries out. She cries out in a way, complaining manner to Elijah, "You man of God, why do you recount my sins to God and bring this disaster to me?" Because in that time, during that time, people are believing because of the sins that God was punishing them in one way or the other. Maybe a sickness, maybe a death. And that's why this woman told very clearly, Elijah, "Man of God, what evil I have done? Why do you recount all my sins to God, and God has brought me this disaster? And Elijah asks for the dead son. He goes to his upper room, lays the dead corpse on his bed, cries to God 3 times. The Bible says God hears his cry, and the son comes back to life. And he brings the son alive and entrusts him to her mother. Dear friends, when we look at this episode of Elijah and the episode of Jesus bringing back the widow's son, Saint Augustine has a wonderful interpretation. Now when we look at all the Gospels, we find 3 instances Jesus brought people back to life. The first instance we find Jairus' daughter, Matthew chapter 9. Jairus was a leader of the synagogue, and he approaches Jesus. His daughter had already died. He comes to Jesus pleading with him, saying that you come home and lay your hands on my daughter and she will live. We do not know how he came to know the power of Jesus, that he was able to bring her back to life. And that is why Jesus immediately goes to his home. And there he tells to the young girl, Talitha kum, young girl, get up. And she comes back to life. And according to St. Augustine, this particular episode of raising Jairus' daughter represents our personal sinfulness that is in our heart. Now in the case of this particular funeral, the girl was not brought out in procession to be taken to the cemetery. The girl was still in the house, and only the relatives and family members knew about the death. And that's why in our lives, St. Augustine says, we have some secret sins deep within our heart, or at least the inclinations to sinfulness. For example, anger. When we are angry, we would like to do harm to others, but we do not do harm. But that indication or inclination itself in some way is a kind of sinfulness that we have inherited, whether it is from Adam, Eve, or from our ancestors or parents. But that is there within our heart. It has not yet come out. That sinfulness has not yet come out. It is deep within our heart. And that represents this Jairus' daughter who died, but requires the help of Jesus to make her rise to life. That's why Jesus goes and makes her rise to life. What does that mean? When we feel that we have these sinful tendencies in our hearts, dear friends, we practically are in the process of dying, and Jesus must help us to revive our life. Jesus must touch us, and Jesus must tell us, Talitha kum, get up from your sin, get up. Don't be in your heart always weak, helpless. I am there to help you. Get up to your life. Now the second is this young guy who died. Now he was brought out in procession to the cemetery. He was not in the house, but was out. Now a lot of people came to know about the funeral of this young guy. There were not only the family members, the relatives, maybe the whole town was accompanying this group along with the widow mother to be taken to the cemetery for burial. That means it is a public, the dead man has become a public figure because of this funeral procession. And St. Augustine says, this is called a public sin. Now public sin, what does that mean, public sin? Public sin is, sometimes in our life we brand people as bad and sinners. Have you noticed that? It happens. Now during the time of Jesus, there were many people. There were tax collectors who were considered to be sinners. There were prostitutes who were considered to be sinners. There were Samaritans who were considered to be sinners. They were so-called the public sinners. Now, whether one is public sinner or a private sinner. What do we need? We need to meet Christ on the way. When we are dead, we need to meet Christ. Or Christ comes to meet us in our sinfulness. It can happen that a sinner goes to the church, gets converted, maybe a word from another person, reading the Bible, receiving the sacrament of reconciliation, whatever. The person encounters Christ and Jesus says, young man, young woman, rise. And that is the power of Christ risen. The third one is the instance of Lazarus. You will find this story in John's Gospel, chapter 11. Now Jesus was at Jordan and someone told him that Lazarus had died or he was asleep, and Jesus says he is asleep. May the glory of God be known now. And he proceeds to Bethany, and it took almost 4 days for him to reach. And then he asks Martha, where have you buried him? And Martha says, Lord, why do you want to go there? There is already a stench. After 4 days, what do you expect from a corpse? But Jesus affirms in a very powerful way, I am the resurrection and the life. John's Gospel, chapter 11, verse 25. I am the resurrection and the life. And then he asks the bystanders to open the grave, to roll back the stone, and he cries out, Lazarus, come out. Now, this particular instance of Lazarus represents those people who live in sin and are dead in sin. That means they are completely entombed in the sinfulness. They are not alive, they are totally dead. Or there is a stench of sin in such people. Now, Jesus is capable of bringing them back to life. And what must be done? We, on our part, we need to try to bring Jesus to that person. Or someone has to bring Jesus to that person who is dying in sin. That is our responsibility. Now in the case of Lazarus, it was Martha, it was the disciple of Jesus, or the relatives of Lazarus who came and informed Jesus. They in some way managed to bring Jesus close to the tomb, and Jesus was able to bring Lazarus back to life. From this, what do we understand? There is always hope in Jesus. That is the great lesson for us Christians. And that's why St. Paul, who has given us this beautiful reading, the reading from Galatians, the second reading we just read, he was a sinful man. He was killing the Christians. He was a die-hard Jew who wanted to kill all the followers of Christ with the sword. But then he says, what I got from God, it is not from my imagination or it's not from human beings. It is directly coming from God to me. And I believed I knew only Cephas and James, the brother of Jesus. But then in my life, if I have got something, I got it from God. And he says in his letter to the Romans, chapter 10, verse 9, if we believe that Jesus is risen for us, we are already saved. For us Christians, dear friends, we need not put our head down and legs up to go to heaven. The most important thing that we have to do is to confess that Jesus is risen for me and reflect that resurrected spirit in my daily life. I'll give you an example. Now, yesterday evening I was preparing myself for celebrating Mass at 4 p.m. And as usual, I always peep through the windows of the church in to know how many people are there. And I was just talking to Terry. I says, today we have a good number of people. And I said, most probably they are all tourists and people around here who have come. You know, when the church is full, we always make a comment here in Guardian Angels. Many tourists have come to Vancouver from the cruise lines and they come here. Today we had 2 other masses packed. Full of people. And as I was observing the people, people were looking at their left side of the church. And I thought, not all, many people. And I thought, why they look on the left side of the church? And I observed the sun was shining so brightly through these stained glass windows. They were looking so beautiful. They were not looking this side. This side was dull. That side was bright. Then I thought, well, this is a good example for me to share with the people. Dear friends, when the resurrected Christ's Spirit shines through us, we become live and beautiful, energetic and full of life. As what the stained glass windows, if they can shine so brightly because of the sun, how much more we can shine in our life because we are capable of experiencing Jesus resurrected in our life. And how can that happen? It can happen through sacraments, our contact with Christ through Holy Eucharist, reconciliation, and many other ways and means we can come and experience Jesus in our hearts. And that is what we find in today's gospel passage. Jesus meeting with that dead young man, just with his word, young man, rise up to life. That is what Christ is going to tell us. Young man or woman, old man or woman, or depressed man or woman, rise up to life, because I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, dear friends, during this week, we have a wonderful gospel for our reflection. Let us try our best to interiorize the Spirit of Christ resurrected, that we may become strong people filled with faith and love for Christ and humanity. Kindly rise before us.